Nora Pearson had built a quiet, measured life in Asheville, North Carolina, nestled among book stacks and community bulletin boards in the municipal library where she had worked for nearly a decade. She had a routine that never changed: morning coffee with a splash of honey, an early walk through the tree-lined streets of Kenilworth, then hours spent archiving, curating, and helping elderly patrons print emails from their grandchildren. She was known for her calm demeanor and kindness, always the one to remember birthdays or bring soup when a neighbor fell ill. Her life, by all appearances, was ordinary and safe. She lived with her husband, Thomas, in a modest craftsman house with deep blue shutters and a front porch overgrown with morning glories. Thomas was charming, always quick with a joke in public, the kind of man who offered to carry strangers' groceries to their cars. He sold high-end furniture and often came home smelling of polished oak and leather. To neighbors and friends they were a perfect pair, her softness balancing his confidence. But within the walls of their home, things had begun to shift. Subtle at first, like the sudden way his jaw tensed when she interrupted, or the way his hand lingered too long on her shoulder after a disagreement, not out of affection, but assertion. Over time, Thomas's mood turned more erratic. He grew impatient with small things: forgotten keys, burned toast, a mismatched sock, and became increasingly preoccupied with financial matters. He began watching documentaries about life insurance fraud and estate planning. Nora noticed, but brushed it off as a phase. Then one evening, over wine and spreadsheets, he suggested she increase her life insurance coverage. It was framed as a precaution, a gesture of love, just in case something ever happened. He had already done the paperwork, typed her name, his as beneficiary, and all that was left was her signature. She signed without thinking twice. After all, Thomas was older than her by 8 years, and she trusted him implicitly. It was the kind of trust that came from years of shared breakfasts and inside jokes, the kind built quietly in the ordinary rituals of domestic life. But something inside her, a flicker she couldn't name, felt disturbed by how eager he was, how carefully he calculated the policy's numbers, how relieved he seemed once the documents were submitted. A few weeks later, to celebrate their wedding anniversary, Thomas proposed a weekend in the Great Smoky Mountains. Nora had always loved the Blue Ridge vistas, the way mist clung to the treetops like breath on glass. They rented a secluded cabin and spent the first day hiking under a canopy of gold and red leaves. On the second evening, just before sunset, Thomas suggested one last trail, short, he said, with a spectacular view. The trail led them to a narrow overlook, a jagged ledge jutting out over the valley below. The air smelled of pine and rain-soaked earth. Nora stood near the edge, taking in the horizon, the rolling blue that stretched endlessly before her. She never saw his face change. She only felt the force against her back, sudden, violent, unmistakable. She screamed as her feet slipped, arms flailing in the empty air until her fingers found a tangle of roots growing from the hillside. Her body slammed against the slope, bruising her ribs, scraping her arms, but she held on. Below her, the forest dropped into silence. She didn't cry. She didn't call out. She waited. Above, she heard Thomas pacing. His voice rang out, trembling, not with fear, but with calculation, as he called emergency services, reporting a fall. He said she had leaned too far, that she lost her footing, that he couldn't see her anywhere. Nora pressed herself into the earth, trembling with the knowledge that her life had just ended in his eyes. He thought she was gone. And in that moment, bruised and breathless, she realized the truth. Her husband had just tried to kill her. Nora emerged from the underbrush hours after the fall, covered in dirt, her hands scraped raw, her legs trembling from the strain of navigating the steep terrain in near-total darkness. She moved without direction, driven only by instinct and the primal need to survive. Her body ached with every step, but fear was a more powerful engine than pain. The forest grew colder as night pressed in, and somewhere in the distance, she heard sirens, soft, searching, meant for show, not rescue. Eventually, she reached a narrow service road winding through the edge of the national park. Her clothes were torn, her face swollen from a branch that had caught her cheek, but she kept walking until headlights appeared. A truck slowed, then stopped. The driver, a weary man hauling supplies to Tennessee, asked no questions when she said her car had broken down and she'd been hiking alone. She gave him a name that wasn't hers, something simple and forgettable. He dropped her off at a gas station 2 towns away just before dawn. From there, she took a bus to Greenville, South Carolina, using cash she had hidden in her sock. Emergency money Thomas never knew about. There, in a dim corner of the terminal, she borrowed a stranger's phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. Gerald Compton, a semi-retired attorney and former colleague of her father, answered with a voice tinged with confusion. When he heard her name and the trembling urgency in her tone, he understood enough to meet her in person. That night, under a different name and with a hoodie pulled low over her face, Nora met him in an empty parking garage. While Gerald arranged the legal groundwork for her next moves, Nora found shelter with Lorraine, the woman whose face she'd once patched up in the library's bathroom and helped escape a violent boyfriend 5 years prior. Lorraine had never forgotten her kindness. Now she repaid it tenfold, offering a spare room, clean clothes, and silence. Back in Asheville, search crews scoured the mountains. Police found Nora's scarf snagged on a bush near the ledge and a smear of blood on a rock. With no sign of her body downstream, they presumed she had fallen into the river and been swept away. After 72 hours, she was declared missing, presumed dead. The local newspaper ran a sympathetic profile: a quiet woman, beloved librarian, tragic accident. The community mourned. Thomas, meanwhile, played the grieving husband with unsettling precision. He organized a memorial service at the Arboretum where they once picnicked, invited friends and family, and posted a filtered photo of Nora on social media with a caption about losing the light of his life. Donations poured in for a charity she had volunteered with. Comments flooded the post: prayers, disbelief, admiration for his strength. He wore sorrow like a tailored suit. Less than 2 weeks after her disappearance, Thomas filed a claim with the insurance company. His tone was rehearsed, his handwriting calm. He submitted all the right documents. There were no doubts raised, no red flags. The system moved forward, greased by the efficiency of routine and the assumption that no one would fake grief so thoroughly. Nora watched it all from Lorraine's guest room. On an old laptop with a spoofed identity, she monitored public posts, tracked news alerts, and followed the status of her own death through whispers and headlines. She changed her hair, bleaching it to a dull straw blonde. She wore thick glasses with non-prescription lenses. Her gait shifted, slower, more deliberate, like someone always slightly unsure of her footing. She removed every trace of her digital self, destroyed her cell phone, canceled all cards, and withdrew from the world like breath from glass. She became invisible, a ghost, a statistic with no body, but she was never truly gone. Hidden beneath the silence and fear was something growing, colder than grief, sharper than betrayal. She wasn't ready to confront him. Not yet. But she was watching. And she was remembering every lie, every post, every carefully curated sob he offered to the world. Because ghosts have the advantage of surprise. And Nora intended to return. Nora spent her days in silence, surrounded by maps, printouts, and handwritten notes pinned across the guest room walls like pieces of a crime board. She kept the windows covered at all times, venturing outside only in early dawn or dusk, wrapped in layers that disguised her silhouette. Her hair, now a brittle shade of pale yellow, was always tucked under a cap. She avoided mirrors, but when she caught her reflection by accident, she barely recognized the woman staring back. There was something fractured in the gaze, something colder, watchful. It wasn't fear, it was calculation. From her makeshift workstation, Nora began building her archive. She used encrypted browsers and disposable emails, set up dummy accounts to follow Thomas's every online move. Each public post, each photo from a bar or a charity event went into a digital folder labeled Performance. She captured screenshots of him smiling with friends, raising glasses to new beginnings, his arm wrapped around a brunette in a cocktail dress. Comments under the photos painted him as a man who was starting to heal. Nora saved them all. Through contacts Gerald had provided, she gained access to publicly available financial filings. From there, she began tracing Thomas's transactions. He had moved large sums into a new investment account, paid off the mortgage on their house in a single wire transfer, and spent thousands on clothing, electronics, and something that looked like a down payment for a sports car. It was reckless, fast, as if he believed the world had gifted him a fresh start and he was determined to spend it quickly. The speed with which he burned through the insurance payout confirmed what she already suspected. Thomas believed she was gone for good. He had also resumed dating, carelessly. Through her burner profiles, Nora connected dots between photos, event check-ins, and tagged locations. He was seeing a woman named Dana, a dental hygienist with a loud laugh and a love of wine bars. They had met barely 3 weeks after Nora's death. The two were now regulars at a trendy downtown gastropub where Thomas told half-truths about his late wife to anyone who asked. He called it a tragedy that had freed him. Nora noted every detail. Then came the break she hadn't expected. A comment left on a backroad hiking forum by a man named Dale Henson, a retired game warden, caught her attention. He mentioned seeing a well-dressed man yelling into a phone like the world was ending near a restricted trail in the Smokies around the same weekend Nora had disappeared. The man had thrown something into the brush and sped off in a black SUV. Dale hadn't thought much of it until he heard about the accident. Nora contacted him through a masked account, posing as a freelance investigator writing about negligence in national parks. They spoke over encrypted audio. His memory was sharp. He still remembered the license plate. It matched Thomas's vehicle. Encouraged by this, Nora took a bolder step. She contacted a local journalist named Melanie Carr, whom she remembered from a library panel event 2 years prior. Melanie had once written a searing exposé on municipal corruption and had the kind of skeptical instincts Nora needed. Reaching out under the alias Lena Vance, she claimed to be an independent investigator pursuing a case of possible insurance fraud linked to a woman presumed dead. She fed Melanie pieces of the story: the rushed payout, the financial inconsistencies, the witness near the trailhead. She didn't reveal her identity, only promised evidence soon. Melanie, intrigued by the precision of the information, began asking questions. Her calls to the insurance company and local authorities returned vague answers, but enough to spark her curiosity. She agreed to keep the lead confidential, for now, and hinted that her editor would greenlight a piece if the story had legs. Nora promised proof would follow. Later that week, under cover of night, Nora sent an anonymous email to the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office. The message included GPS coordinates of the overlook where the incident took place, along with the name of the warden who witnessed Thomas's behavior and a list of inconsistencies in the original police report. She wrote with clinical detachment, offering no emotion, no explanation, only data. At the end of the message, she added a single line: "Sometimes the dead are the only ones who see the truth." After hitting send, she sat motionless for several minutes. The weight of the moment pressed against her ribs like a closing fist. She wasn't just watching anymore. She had entered the board. The game had begun. The day began like any other for Thomas Pearson, with curated normalcy and self-satisfaction. He was hosting a dinner that evening for Dana and a few of her friends, celebrating what he referred to as the start of his real life. The house was spotless. Candles were arranged in minimalist holders, and a bottle of imported red breathed quietly on the counter. Thomas checked his reflection, smoothed his shirt collar, and practiced his easy smile. Everything was under control, until the envelope arrived. It came with the afternoon mail, unremarkable in appearance but stamped with the logo of the insurance company. He opened it casually, expecting confirmation of the next disbursement. Instead, his eyes narrowed as he read the carefully worded notice. The payout had been temporarily frozen. An internal audit had been triggered by third-party information suggesting inconsistencies in the circumstances surrounding the insured's disappearance. They were initiating a fraud investigation. No further funds would be released. The paper trembled slightly in his hands. He spent the next hour pacing the kitchen, calling his claims adjuster, only to be told there was nothing they could discuss over the phone. His voice rose in frustration, but the response remained firm and rehearsed. Something had shifted. He felt it in his chest like a coming storm. By the time the doorbell rang just before dusk, the evening had already soured. When he opened the door, instead of Dana or one of her friends, he was met by a news crew. A camera light snapped on. The reporter, Melanie Carr, introduced herself briskly and asked for a comment on a developing story involving suspicions of insurance fraud and a possibly staged accident in the Great Smoky Mountains. Behind her, a van with the channel's logo idled at the curb. Thomas tried to shut the door, but the questions followed through the frame, about a witness, about the investigation, about a woman presumed dead but never found. He slammed the door, retreating inside, pulse pounding. Outside, the news van remained parked. Inside, the world was no longer his. 40 minutes later, just as the sun dipped below the tree line, someone stepped into his backyard. He noticed the movement from the kitchen window. At first, he thought it was one of the reporters circling around the property. He stepped outside, ready to yell, but the figure standing near the garden stopped him mid-breath. She looked nothing like the version he had buried in words and lies. Her clothes were soiled, her left arm in a sling, her hair cut roughly and bleached pale. Her face was thinner, harder, the softness replaced with something cold and deliberate. In her other hand, she held a folder, documents, photos, printouts. She stood completely still, eyes locked on him like a figure from a fever dream. For a brief moment, neither moved. Then came the sound of footsteps behind her. Uniformed officers approached from the driveway, followed by a man in a blazer carrying a leather case. One of the officers read Thomas his rights as the camera crew, now filming from the gate, captured the moment in full. Nora remained silent. She didn't flinch as they cuffed him. She didn't blink when he looked at her, color draining from his face. He understood then. She had never disappeared. She had watched, listened, waited, and chosen the precise moment to return. That night, local broadcasts interrupted programming with a special report. The story of Nora Pearson, the woman who faked her death to expose a murder plot, flooded social media. News anchors used words like shocking, unprecedented, cinematic. But for Nora, there was no satisfaction in spectacle. As Thomas was led away, she turned and walked out of the frame, already leaving the scene behind. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation long before the trial officially began. Reporters lined the sidewalk outside the Buncombe County Courthouse, their lenses trained on every arriving attorney, every rustle of a legal briefcase. Inside, spectators filled the benches. Local residents, true crime enthusiasts, and retired judges packed into the narrow wooden rows, all eager to witness the case that had captured the region's attention. They called it the ghost trial in the press, and headlines had already etched Nora Pearson's story into regional legend. The prosecution came prepared. They presented a case with the clinical precision of surgeons. Exhibits included bank statements showing the rapid movement of life insurance funds, email correspondence between Thomas and the claims agent, and photos of his luxury purchases made within days of Nora's disappearance. More damning were the hidden camera recordings Nora had obtained, the hotel confession where Thomas spoke of leaving the past behind, and the footage of him toasting to clean slates with his new partner. Each clip landed like a hammer strike. Witnesses followed. Dale Henson, the retired game warden, testified about the man he saw on the day of the alleged accident, describing Thomas's erratic behavior and the object he threw into the woods. A forensic analyst confirmed that the scarf found at the site had been strategically placed, not left behind by accident. Then came Melanie Carr, the journalist who verified the anonymous emails she received, and how the timeline of the investigation aligned with Nora's gradual reappearance. The defense tried to reshape the narrative. They painted Thomas as a grieving husband who had suffered a psychological break. They claimed his extravagant behavior stemmed from trauma and confusion, that the death had seemed so real he had simply acted irrationally. Nora's deception, they argued, was equally disturbing, suggesting her disappearance had emotionally destabilized Thomas. They called him a man in mourning, not a murderer. But the strategy unraveled during Thomas's own testimony. Under cross-examination, his composure cracked. Pressed about the speed with which he filed the claim and spent the money, he slipped. He spoke of the policy as a way out, of the accident as an opportunity that he never planned, but didn't stop either. The courtroom grew silent as the words sank in. The jury watched him intently, reading not just his words but the tone, the arrogance bleeding through the cracks. His lawyer tried to interject, but the damage was done. The final arguments from the prosecution were searing. They described a man who saw his wife not as a partner, but as a payout. They reminded the jury that justice wasn't about punishing emotion. It was about protecting life from premeditated harm. The phrase cold calculation echoed more than once in the courtroom. After 3 days of deliberation, the verdict was announced: guilty on all counts, attempted murder, insurance fraud, and obstruction of justice. The judge, stern and unmoved, sentenced Thomas Pearson to 20 years in state prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel dropped with a weight that seemed to shake the entire room. Outside, news crews rushed to cover the breaking headline. The woman who returned from the dead became the story of the month. Nora's name trended for days. Interview requests flooded her lawyer's inbox. True crime podcasts scrambled to record emergency episodes. But Nora declined all invitations. She did not stay for the sentencing. She had no interest in watching him vanish behind concrete and bars. Instead, she drove westward, far from Asheville, in a second-hand car with no plates registered in her name. She had a new ID, a new haircut, and a map with no destination marked, just freedom in every direction. For the first time in years, she was no one's wife, no one's ghost, no one's victim. She belonged only to herself. A year later, Nora lived under a different name in Boulder, Colorado, in a quiet rental home tucked beneath the shadows of the Flatirons. The house had wide windows, but no curtains, not because she had nothing to hide, but because she had nothing left to fear. The neighborhood was peaceful, low voices in the mornings, bicycles clinking down the sidewalk, the faint sound of guitars drifting from porches on Sunday afternoons. She kept her life simple: no television, no social media, just books, plants, and a steady rhythm of her own making. She had chosen the name Mara Whitaker, simple, soft, and utterly disconnected from everything she had once been. At first, the name felt foreign in her mouth, like trying on a coat that didn't fit. But as days turned into weeks, she grew into it. Strangers called her Mara at the grocery store, at the local bakery, at the shelter where she now volunteered. And every time she responded, it became less of a disguise and more of a declaration. She was no longer a shadow of someone else's story. She worked 4 mornings a week at a nonprofit center that provided legal and psychological support to women escaping domestic abuse. She greeted them with warmth and calm, never introducing herself as a survivor, only as someone who could listen. The stories she heard often mirrored fragments of her own past, but she never projected. She offered coffee, silent company, and the assurance that rebuilding was not only possible, it was deserved. In the evenings, she wrote, at first the words came in jagged bursts, raw, broken, disorganized, but eventually they shaped themselves into chapters. A memoir, yes, but more than that. A document of resistance, of vigilance, of how it felt to be erased and then to return. Her manuscript was halfway through when a small independent publisher in Denver reached out after reading her anonymous essay in a trauma recovery journal. They were interested. She sent a sample under the pen name. A week later, they asked for the full draft. Some nights, the past still surfaced in dreams. The sound of soil crumbling beneath her shoes, the cold branch biting into her palms, the moment before the fall, suspended in air, weightless and full of dread. She would wake up in darkness, breath caught in her chest. But now she had a routine. She would rise, pour herself a glass of water, and walk barefoot to the hallway where one framed piece hung on the wall. A simple white border around plain black text, "You are alive, and no one gets to take that from you." She would stare at it for a moment. Then she would exhale and return to bed, pulling the blanket up not just for warmth, but as a small act of peace. Nora Pearson had died once, publicly, legally, ceremonially. But Mara Whitaker had been born in the quiet aftermath, not from fear, but from choice. And with every step, every word, every breath, she wrote a new life into existence.